Hey now, everyone. Good to see you all. Good evening. How you all doing? Good, good. Well, we know that Deadheads are like sports fans, and this evening we're really putting that to the test by hosting this event in Los Angeles at the same time as our beloved Dodgers play a pivotal Game 6. For those who are interested, it's 3-1 at the top of the 7th. The Blue Jays are up. Game 5. But we're here today to celebrate something very different. I'm very grateful to the hard work of so many people in making this event possible on such short notice. Much love to the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, Visions and Voices, the Thornton School of Music, the Ivy and Young Academy, and the good folks here at the Brain and Creativity Institute, which, as you can tell, is the most stunning and intimate venue on campus. But most of all, I'm so grateful to all of you for being here today, for battling traffic, for showing up for this very special event, especially on a day where there's so much else happening in our town and in our world. I've been at USC for 18 years, and during that time, I've literally hosted dozens of book talks on every conceivable topic, including the panels I moderate each year for the LA Times Festival of Books. But this evening's book talk is arguably the only one that I'm actually qualified to host. That's because I'm a deadhead through and through. Where are my deadheads at? Anyone here tonight? Yeah. It's an obsession, but it's pleasing. I first encountered the Grateful Dead as a 14-year-old when the first girl I ever loved was going through a traumatic moment in her life. I sent her flowers at that time, which are the first flowers I ever sent anyone. I still remember it cost me $20, which was a small fortune in the late 80s. A good friend of mine at the time suggested the perfect line for the card, and it turns out it was a line from a Grateful Dead song, a Hunter Garcia composition. The song was China Doll, and the line was, "Take up your China doll, it's only fractured, just a little nervous from the fall." That experience brought me to a core truth early in my life, that there's a perfect line from a Grateful Dead song for every situation. 2 years later, as soon as I got my driver's license, I drove up from Newport Beach, where I was raised, to the Wiltern Theater right here in Los Angeles to see the Jerry Garcia Band on November 16th, 1990, the first time I ever saw the man who I would soon be following around the country. And the following year, on June 1st, 1991, I skipped my junior prom in high school to drive up to the Los Angeles Coliseum right here at USC to see my first Grateful Dead concert. That was a sliding doors moment for me. I rejected at that moment, I think, what the world expected of me, that I would go to prom and embrace what I wanted to do instead, which was join the traveling Grateful Dead Carnival. Anyone here? I know Phil was at that show. Anyone here at the June 1st show? Yeah, nice to see you. Since that fateful day, I've seen 125 Dead shows and counting, including over 50 with Jerry. For me, as an immigrant to this country from India, I felt like I was neither here nor there growing up. When I was in India, everyone saw me as American, and when I came to the US, everyone saw me as Indian, but I didn't feel like I lived in either place. I had a profound sense of psychological dislocation growing up. They used to call us ABCDs, American-born confused Desis. Desi is someone from India, and so we really felt that. But I found my tribe with the Grateful Dead. I felt like I belonged for the first time in a community of people that also didn't fit in anywhere else, but fit in with each other. A group of inside outsiders who became a sacred community. And that's why for me, as the Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life at USC and the person who oversees more religious groups and campus chaplains than anyone in the United States, in the heart of the most religiously diverse city in human history, I can honestly say that I've learned as much about my spiritual life from the Grateful Dead as I did from going to seminary, living in a monastery, studying the wisdom texts, and teaching comparative religion. And Jim Berklow, who's sitting right here, was the Associate Dean of Religious Life for many years here. He can attest that when I interviewed him for the job, he told me he wrote a sermon about the Grateful Dead, and he got the job on the spot. He couldn't have said anything better than that. This evening, and so as you can tell, this evening is very special for me. It's my first Grateful Dead event at USC since I saw them in 1991 at the Coliseum. This evening, we have the great honor of hosting Jim Newton to discuss his new biography of Jerry Garcia, here beside the rising tide. Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead, and an American Awakening. Jim is a journalist, teacher, and author of Justice for All, Eisenhower, Worthy Fights, and Man of Tomorrow. He was with the LA Times for 25 years as a reporter, bureau chief, editorial page editor, columnist, and editor-at-large. He lives in Pasadena and teaches at UCLA, but we'll forgive him for that this evening. He's also the founder and editor of the award-winning public affairs magazine, Blueprint. His latest book, which we celebrate today, is a national bestseller and a history of the Grateful Dead that explores the American counterculture through the life of the iconoclastic frontman, Jerry Garcia. In 1965 in Palo Alto, Jerry Garcia opened a dictionary to a fable in which an appreciative soul repays the generosity of a traveler, a gift of the Grateful Dead. After a traumatic car accident that injured him and killed a close friend of his, Garcia had resolved to build his life around music. He practiced relentlessly and traveled across the Northern California folk and bluegrass scene. He gathered up some fellow musicians and formed a band, and now they had their name. Following the history of the Grateful Dead means tracking American cultural history through a period of radical reconsideration. The Dead played at the acid tests, at the Human Be-In, at Woodstock, at the occupation of Columbia University, at the Bell Ball for People's Park. They performed at the base of the pyramids during a lunar eclipse, at Madison Square Garden to defend the rainforests, in San Francisco to sound alarm over the AIDS epidemic, and maybe most importantly, at Huey Newton's birthday party. For 3 decades, the band explored the meaning and the limits of freedom. The radical message of the Dead, to reject the mainstream and build a bohemian community, radiated across the world and manifests itself in art, music, business, and politics. Here Beside the Rising Tide tells the story of those disparate shafts of light, putting Garcia into a broader context while tracing his eventful life. Nearly a century after his birth, Garcia's influence stretches onward, expressed in guitar licks and a gentle way of life, one of excellence and gratitude, chasing freedom, living moment to moment, guided by song, reminding us of a time before phones destroyed everything. Amen to that. This evening's event will unfold in the following manner. First, I'll ask Jim some questions about his book. This morning, my 11-year-old daughter astutely told me that this will be the hardest interview I've ever done because I have so many questions and that it shouldn't just be about me, so I'll try not to make this about me. Then we'll open it up for a question and answer with everyone here today. And afterwards, Jim has kindly agreed to stick around. We're selling copies of the book outside. He'll stick around and autograph your books, personalize your books, and so I suggest picking up a copy of this extraordinary new biography for yourself and your 20 closest friends. So you're all fired up? Yeah, you ready to go? Grateful to be here? Are you kind? Please join me in giving a very warm Trojan welcome to my friend and yours, Jim Newton.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Very sweet. Thank you.
All right, let's get right into this. You know this already, but of all the contemporary artists and musicians, Jerry Garcia is probably the person who has been written about the most. He's the person who's been the most recorded as a musician, the most scrutinized, the most archived, the most studied, the most interrogated, the most reflected upon. So why, after all of this sort of output on his life and his legacy, did you decide to spend 4 years writing this book? What did you want to achieve? And for a life as sort of mythologized as Jerry Garcia, how did you think about this as biography as opposed to hagiography?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Well, first of all, I started thinking about this book a long time ago. I had thought about it maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago even. For a variety of reasons, I kept pushing it back. Longest period pushed back because I was deciding whether to do this or a book on Jerry Brown, which I have written. But when Brown became available to do a bunch of interviews for that book, I figured, well, Garcia's already dead, and I should catch Brown while he's alive. So that was another 4-year delay. So I've been thinking about it a long time, but I guess what I thought when I read what was out there on Garcia, it struck me that most of it was hagiographic. Most of it was really written by people who understandably revered him and wanted to kind of give expression to that. I thought there was still room to write something that was both more removed, more sort of conventionally biographical, but also that stitched him together with the larger counterculture, which is another thing that I've wanted to write about for a long time. So really the way I thought of this book, and the way I hope it comes through to readers, to all of you, is that it's a story, it's really 2 books. It's a book about the counterculture and it's a book about Garcia, with Garcia as the sort of central figure of that counterculture. And that felt to me like a new way to approach this. So.
Like I said earlier, there's a perfect Grateful Dead line or verse for every situation. You really found it for the title of this book. Here Beside the Rising Tide, of course, is a line from one of Jerry's most famous songs, Uncle John's Band, but also a metaphor for how Jerry was simultaneously a product and progenitor
of the cultural zeitgeist he lived in. Can you talk a little bit more about how the title of the book shapes your thesis about the way Jerry acted and moved in the world?
All that's correct. And I would add, there's also a Grateful Dead lyric that doesn't fit every situation, right? And so we went through a lot of tries on this. Well, the working title of the book when I was getting started was Prophet on a Burning Shore, which I'm sure many of you will know is also a Grateful Dead lyric. It has some problems as a title, which I thought about more and more as I was working on the book. One is it's not a Garcia lyric, it's a Bob Weir lyric. The other is that it refers obliquely to the kind of wild, sort of messianic deadhead, and it makes a little bit of fun of that figure. So I didn't like the idea of calling Garcia a prophet. I didn't like the idea that it was using a lyric that wasn't his, and I didn't really like the sort of intonation of it. So about 2/3 of the way through the writing of the book, we decided we needed a different title. And that began like year-long exchange of emails between myself, my agent, and my editor as we each tried out, Not Fade Away, I don't know, we came up with 100 of them probably. This one though, once we hit it, all of us, it hit us the same moment as correct. For some of the reasons that you just alluded to. It felt to me like it captures the right place of Garcia and the Dead in the counterculture, that it is a rising tide, which suggests something positive happening, that they're beside it, they are not causing the tide to rise, they're not riding it up or down, that they are kind of there observing it and part of the episode, but not integral to it at all, at every moment anyway. And it of course comes from Uncle John's band, so it had a real authenticity about Garcia. And then what really sealed the deal, frankly, is then when we started trying out covers, and I don't even know who it was, but someone at Random House found this photograph. This is Jerry at Stinson Beach in Northern California, 72, 73, I think, and it's by Annie Leibovitz, the wonderful photographer. The fact that it captured tide and ocean and all of it, at that point the whole thing felt organic and correct.
I've read all the Jerry biographies, I'm sure a lot of people here have, and one of the things I really appreciated about your book was how meticulously researched it is. That's especially true in your section about his childhood, his family, and the environment in which he was raised. In your book, you talk specifically about 2 childhood traumas that shaped him for the rest of his life, the loss of his finger and the loss of his father. Mm-hmm. Why were these events so significant, and how did they impact young Jerry, and how do we see that play out over his life?
Yeah, well, I guess we should start by noting that it is not the best launching pad for a guitar player to lose a finger, and so he lost a finger that he was able to work around, and obviously he didn't know how to play the guitar before he lost it, so he never had to relearn the guitar without the finger. But it was not a great start.
Although maybe it gave him a different playing sensibility or picking style.
It may have, and a little bit unrelated, but I've also thought that when he got his first guitar, he didn't know how to tune it, and so he had to develop his own tuning for it. And I've often thought that probably helped his ear, that he really had to work his way through his instrument, and the finger might have contributed to that too. But they rushed to the hospital. Some of you probably know, may all know, it was an accident. He and his brother were playing around with an axe and some kindling, and his brother cut it off. They tried to repair it, but it was too late. But the real searing loss of his childhood was the following summer, when he and his mother and his father went fishing in Northern California, and his father drowned. There's a little bit of, Jerry used to remember that he had actually witnessed his father drowning. That seems unlikely, given the source material that we can find about it, including newspaper stories about it. But what's clear is that he experienced the drowning. He was there on the trip when it happened. His father was there one moment and gone the next. And that it utterly disrupted the rest of his childhood. His mother couldn't handle him and his brother, so she sent him off to their grandparents, and he grew up with them, developed asthma. He had a very rough first few years. And I'm no psychiatrist, and I'm reluctant to say too much about the psychological effect on him, except I don't think it's a coincidence that someone who lost that sense of family so early on and so traumatically craved it the rest of his life. And that the Grateful Dead family, as they referred to themselves, had a kind of a family structure to it. The business had a kind of family structure to it. Even Deadheads and fans of the band, there has always been that deep sense of community, unlike that around any other band that I'm aware of anyway. And that's a projection, I think, of Garcia's longing for all of that.
One of the themes in your book is this theme of improvisation, that Garcia was the master improviser, not just in music, but in leadership and business and spirituality. And I kind of want to follow that thread over these next few questions, starting with music. You know, much to my chagrin, and many of us who love Jerry, Jerry is never on the list of greatest guitar players or greatest gods. On the latest list of the 250 greatest guitarists of all time in Rolling Stone, Jerry clocks in at 34, somehow behind Neil Young. I mean, I love Neil Young, but come on.
That does
As
seem
a guitarist, like, come on. And Tom Morello and St. Vincent. So he's never, I think he's underappreciated by mainstream audiences and music critics for his guitar playing, maybe because it's hard to categorize it. It's bluegrass, it's R&B, it's folk, it's rock, it's jazz, it's gospel. It's a uniquely American style. Maybe it's its own genre of music. But a few years ago, John Mayer, who now plays the role of Jerry in Dead & Company, said, quote, "Several years ago, I set out not just to learn Garcia's approach to the guitar and the songs he played, but to learn what about it has allowed millions of people who don't play the guitar to key into it for hours on end. Soloing has always been known since its inception as a kind of self-indulgent expression. Why then could so many listeners, myself included, listen to him do it endlessly without fatigue?" So how would you answer that question? Why are so many people who don't know that much about the guitar endlessly fascinated with Garcia's playing?
Yeah, I think Garcia genuinely communicates with the guitar, whereas a lot of, Beth and I were just talking about this a minute ago, a lot of sort of the great guitar, the sort of thrasher, speed metal guitar players are fast. They're super fast. But they're not really attempting to connect. It's more dazzling than it is interesting. Where Garcia, who could play fast, but really chose to connect and to blend the styles that you refer to. He was an absolutely obsessive rehearser, practicer, to the point that he would drive people around him crazy, especially when he was young. I think that his development as a banjo player also affected it. He very much played a note at a time. There's not a lot of just sort of mushing of notes. And I think that his musical curiosity that draws upon all those various genres gives it a sound unlike any other, and may only get him to number 34 on the Rolling Stone list, but it certainly earned him legions of not just fans, but real devotees. So I think that the commitment that he put into it and that he inspired is really unlike anyone else.
I want to shift to leadership. Of course, the Grateful Dead were famous for being a democratic band. Everyone had a say, everyone had a voice, even the person on the street had a say.
Yeah, just chaotic would be the other word, yeah.
No one was the boss. Rock Scully used to say, the situation is the boss. But Jerry sang, of course, famously in Ramble on Rose, "I'm going to march you up and down the county line, take you to the leader of the band." Jerry was the leader of the band. He didn't maybe want to be the leader of the band, but he clearly was. When he died, the band was over. And yet he distrusted anyone telling anyone what to do. So how did he lead the Grateful Dead, especially as he was proactively trying not to lead the Grateful Dead?
Yeah, he would certainly object to it if we were to here this evening call him the leader of the Grateful Dead. He objected to it really from the beginning to his death. And yet he was indisputably the leader of the Grateful Dead. You know, if you read the other memoirs by other members of the Dead, Kreutzmann has one, Phil Lesh, Mickey Hart has a sort of half one. All of them are the story about them and their relationship with Jerry. They're none of them about their relationships with each other. So they all recognized that he was who they were looking to. When there was ever a decision about whether a song belonged as or sort of qualified as a Grateful Dead song, all eyes always turned to Garcia. So as much as he tried to not be the leader of the Dead, everybody else around him recognized him as such. Mm-hmm. What he didn't do, and really refused to be drawn into, with an exception or two maybe, was to exercise any kind of administrative control over the Grateful Dead. And the Dead, and we can talk about them in a moment, the Dead occasionally had these sort of flashes of brilliance in business or in other areas, more, I think, by happenstance than by design. But Garcia didn't like telling other people what to do. He didn't like being told what to do. So he was not particularly well qualified to run the band in that sense. He was its musical and spiritual center, which is a little bit different than what he would describe as a leader, I think.
The same thing I think is true politically. Garcia famously despised all political parties, politicians. He said on voting, the lesser of two evils is still evil. He never preached from the stage. He never endorsed a candidate. He never took political positions publicly. But, and as a result, I think the Grateful Dead are a big tent. You have progressive Deadheads. That's what my friends and I think of ourselves as. But Tucker Carlson and Ann Coulter are also part of the Deadhead community.
Yeah. Well, it's not up to me, but yeah.
And Jerry, despite sort of rejecting mainstream politics, he played benefits for the Black Panthers, for the Rainforest, for San Francisco programs, for after-school music, sports, nutrition, for healthcare programs in San Francisco, for the Rex Foundation, for HIV/AIDS research. So how did Garcia think about a political identity maybe as opposed to moral leadership? And how did he engage those issues that he cared about most?
Yeah, he, again, I think if he were here, it's safe to say that he would object to being described as political. But I think that that says more about what he and maybe we think about as political than what is a different way of thinking about it, which is to say, if what we mean by politics is fundraisers and endorsements and campaign events and messaging and advertising, then he had no interest in any of it. And as you say, he really saw that as a kind of base undertaking. But if we think about politics as values and living and expressing values and having the freedom to do so, then I think Garcia not only is properly thought of as political, but is a really powerful political figure. One of the things we were talking earlier about the Grateful Dead archive up in Santa Cruz, Nick Merriweather, who was the curator of that archive, and I have had a million dinners talking about the Grateful Dead over the last several years. And one of the things that he and I have talked a lot about is the difference between a radical and a bohemian. The 60s and the environment around the Dead in its early years had lots and lots of radicals. You mentioned the Black Panthers. The Panthers, the SDS, the Weathermen, they were all part of the larger orbit around the Dead. It used to be said that the only place you could go and run into both Hell's Angel and a Black Panther was a Grateful Dead show. There's a lot of politics of that type around the band. But there's a different kind of figure, a more culturally political figure, which would be a bohemian. And the way I would distinguish between a radical and a bohemian is that a radical is really trying to change your mind about history or policy or how to move forward. A bohemian is really asking to live a set of values and to be left alone to do so. I would put Garcia in that category. And that category has a lot of political heft. If you can credibly live by values, it's an attraction, right? It attracts people to a way of living. And so I think that the Dead are rightly thought of as bohemians, and Garcia very much as that. And I'm not even sure he would object to that.
There's a book out you might have seen called Everything I Know About Business I Learned from the Grateful Dead that highlights the innovative business practices of the Grateful Dead, like allowing people to record their shows and distribute those concerts for free, running their own record label, their own travel agency, their own ticket service company, building their own instruments and amplification system, the Wall of Sound, for example, producing their own films, having their own newsletters, developing their own merchandise. These business practices are a kind of strategic improvisation, I think, that allowed the Dead to be popular without any radio play or MTV play. How do you view Garcia as maybe an accidental entrepreneur or as a business leader within the Grateful Dead universe? And what do you make of the decisions the band made that were contrarian at the time but are now considered best business practices for bands?
Yeah, they are remarkably prescient by accident over and over again, I would say. One of the things that is preserved at the Grateful Dead archive up at UC Santa Cruz is the minutes of the board, of the Grateful Dead board that would meet quarterly, which you can imagine what the minutes are like. But And there'll be these very strange moments in the minutes where there'll be, item one will be who should warm up for us on the next tour, and they'll kick around names. And item two will be, so-and-so on the cruise getting a divorce, can we give him $1,000? Item three will be tapers and setting up a taper section. The taper section in particular comes up by accident. The Dead had no objection to people taping shows. The music industry did, but Garcia took the position that once he'd played the notes, anyone could do whatever they wanted with it. The only real issue with tapers early on was that they were sort of annoying. And those of you who've been to a lot of shows know if you got too close to people taping, they wanted you to be quiet, or they didn't want people dancing around them and jostling the equipment. The Dead wanted to figure out a way to address some of the irritations that went around taping, but never really entertained the idea of stopping people from taping. And so as they developed, as you all know, the taper section was initially called the tapester section, and then it was moved around a little bit. It was in front of the soundboard for a while, and ultimately behind it. That turned out, that confounded every bit of known wisdom or conventional wisdom in the music industry, which said you don't give away music, because if you give away music, people won't buy your albums. Well, people weren't buying that many Grateful Dead albums anyway, so they didn't have that much to lose. And what it did is it created this other community of enthusiasts who traded tapes, who often went to shows, sometimes made shows themselves, but who became incredibly loyal to the band through these tape collections. And the Dead's only sort of stipulation on them was that people not sell them. As long as they were traded among friends, the Dead made no effort to interfere with that. And it turned out to really build this very devoted fan base. And in the end, what really, the business model of the Grateful Dead is that instead of selling a lot of albums and touring to promote albums, they sold a few albums and they raised money touring. And it doesn't really matter whether you have 1 million fans, 100,000 of whom come to shows when you go to their cities, or if you have 100,000 fans who go to every show in every city. It's as an economic model, it works just as well. So rather than spread themselves very thin, they built up this very devoted core audience. And that ultimately also got very big. So they became they're the highest grossing album, or highest grossing band of the early 1990s. By then, they were bigger than anything.
Near the end of his life, there were a lot of Deadheads who began to deify Jerry Garcia, see him as a martyr, a religious figure of sorts, a prophetic or a messianic figure. Yeah. But there were many, including myself, who saw him as the leader of a spiritual community, even if he was a reluctant leader of that community. And even the Dead used the language of the sacred to describe themselves. Garcia once said the most important part of the 1960s was the spiritual work, not the politics. Phil Lish said that going to a Dead show is like going to church. Mickey Hart said the Dead weren't in the music business, they were in the transportation business, they were transporting consciousness. But perhaps the best example of Garcia as a spiritual figure or even guru is in his incarnation as the psychedelic warrior Captain Trips. To your point of being both of the culture while shaping it, the Grateful Dead are as responsible for the mainstreaming of psychedelics as anyone, and one could argue that we're now living in the golden age of psychedelics. So while Garcia was intensely private about his own drug use, he did talk very positively about how psychedelics transformed his life and about his spiritual life because of psychedelics. Their involvement in the acid test was a very public manifestation of that. Can you speak to Jerry's role as a symbol of the psychedelic movement and, by extension, a leader of a spiritual community?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think that there was, well, maybe with the exception of Timothy Leary, there's probably nobody more associated with the early use of LSD than Garcia and the other members of the Dead, but particularly Garcia. I don't think there is a Grateful Dead without the acid tests, both the drugs of the acid test and also the experience of the acid test, which was also very formative for them because they weren't really, people didn't go to the acid test to listen to the Grateful Dead. They went to the acid test to participate, and the Dead would play for a little while and then not play. Sometimes they played very little at all. So they weren't really the center of attention, and that relationship with the audience that developed in the acid test, it changed. It's hard to have that same relationship in 65,000 people at RFK Stadium, but that idea that there was a smaller wall between the band and the audience than any other musical act starts with the acid test and followed them through all their days. And I think that the effects of LSD are part of that, the sense that they could anticipate each other musically, that they could exchange energy with the audience. Some of that is real or really felt anyway, and some of that is a byproduct of the drugs, for sure. And so I think Garcia was quick to credit LSD with being essential in the formative musical style of the Grateful Dead. Now, there's the later chapters of the book, Garcia's drug use changes. He moved from LSD and weed, basically, to heroin. At first, he sort of pretended that it was China White or that it was Persian smoking powder or something. The fact is, he tried heroin, he became addicted to heroin, and heroin did not have the same effects, whatever positive effects there were from LSD were not there for heroin. Heroin was isolating and ultimately cripplingly isolating for Garcia. So he is both, I think, a case study in some of the potential positive effects of hallucinogens and LSD, and he is clearly a crippling example of the devastating effects that heroin and other drugs can have.
It's impossible to understand Garcia without thinking about the devotion he inspired in his fans, the Deadheads, who have, many of them gave up their lives to follow the Dead from city to city, country to country, from year to year. When I was seeing shows in the 1990s, there were upwards of 10,000 people who were full-time tour heads, who were responsible for an underground economy of language and commerce and ritual and pilgrimage. There was a bumper sticker back in the day when I was following the Dead that said, "Who are the Grateful Dead and why do they keep following me?" I'm going to flip that question on its head and ask you, who are the Deadheads and why do they keep following the band?
Yeah, and why now, too, is another related question, I think, which is because he's been gone a long time, and he was certainly the center of it, and yet it goes on. Well, I think part of that is the music. Part of the music is appealing. The music ages well. It's it's hard for me to imagine. I've not ever been to a Metallica show or a heavy metal show, but it's hard for me to imagine that there are 70 and 80-year-olds in the audience for Metallica. There are for the Grateful Dead.
And 17-year-olds.
And 17-year-olds. And so it is. I mean, when I was up in, I went to the shows in the Dead and Company shows in San Francisco in August. And it's three, arguably four generations of Deadheads now. That's unlike anything else. And as I say, I think part of that is the music. I think there may also be, a big part of it is the music. But I think that there may be a moment in time that we're in now where it does feel that we're very isolated from one another, whether that's phones or COVID or the fucked up politics of the country or whatever, or all of the above. I think that a musical, cultural, fun experience in which the ecstasy is shared, not experienced alone, is especially appealing to a lot of people today. I went to a couple of these shows at the Sphere in Vegas, and I had no desire whatsoever to be in Las Vegas, but it was genuinely fun. I mean, young people were really enjoying it. The people sitting all around me, not one of them was old enough ever to have seen Garcia. And yet there is a bonding that takes place at these shows. There are no, Led Zeppelin heads or Rolling Stones heads. There is something different about the Grateful Dead, and whatever that thing is, I'll say one more thing on it. It has long been recognized as something specific to them. Joseph Campbell was a big fan of the Dead and saw in it connections to ancient ritual and ancient Dionysus and those sort of ecstasy, and so those ideas are not new, but they're rare, and the Dead is the rare cultural musical institution I think that really carries them and is appreciated for them.
Last question, then we'll open it up to everyone for a conversation. It feels like Garcia is more alive now than ever. Dead & Company is one of the top touring acts of this decade, just like the Grateful Dead was of the 1990s. Every city in America has its own Grateful Dead cover band. You just saw Dead & Company with 60,000 people in San Francisco. Jerry has his own clothing line. He has his own cannabis line. We're 30 years after his death, and we're still discussing his legacy here at a major research university. So why does Jerry Garcia still matter?
I think Garcia and the values around that he held and that he manifested musically and spiritually are maybe more important than ever. I mean, I think that we are in a time that has some parallels to the time in which the Dead came alive, so to speak. I mean, I think that the counterculture is another part of this conversation, but the counterculture is a lot of different things. It's politics and arts and music and protest and all the various ways that the counterculture manifested itself. But one thing that every aspect of the counterculture really had in common was an unease, a sense that the dominant institutions in American life didn't represent what people wanted them to. They didn't feel comfortable with them. I guess I would venture the observation that feels pretty true today. And so I think Garcia's relationship with politics, with power, his absolute unwillingness to knuckle under to authority, to simply refuse to recognize the government's authority over him, really, is not the only path through the times we're in, but it's a path, and it's worth thinking about. And it's certainly true that the times we're in are at least as oppressive as the times that he became an adult in. And the last thing I'll just say on that is just maybe a little ray of optimism and all of that. The mainstream political culture that the counterculture confronted essentially took place around civil rights, Vietnam, and the environment. There are a lot of other issues, of course, along the way. But in every one of those areas, the government in Washington was not only unkind and uninterested in the views of the counterculture, it was also backed by a huge mandate. Ronald Reagan in California, Richard Nixon, and then Ronald Reagan as president, all won landslide victories. Richard Nixon was elected in 1972 with more than 60% of the vote. He carried every electoral vote except those of Massachusetts and DC. That's a landslide. Donald Trump has never won a majority of votes in any election he's run in. He has a fragile, self-hating, and internally divisive political community that he attempts to preside over. So the counterculture's challenges were real, and they took a long time for the counterculture to make progress. But their opponents were much more formidable than the ones that are faced today. So anyway, that's a little off Jerry in particular, but I do think that's part of why Garcia as a musician and Garcia as a cultural figure matter today.
Before we get to question and answer, I want to do a quick lightning round. So I'm going to ask you a few questions in this, your first thought and best thought. We're going to be very zen with this. All right. First Grateful Dead concert.
Don't remember the first one that mattered to me, though, was the US Festival in Southern California in 1982.
I saw a bunch of bands at that one. Favorite Hunter Garcia song of the day, of the moment? I know there could be different. I have a different one.
Yeah, I guess Random House would want me to say Uncle John's Band probably, but I think I would say Ripple.
Favorite Grateful Dead studio album?
American Beauty.
Favorite Grateful Dead concert or live album?
Oh, album?
Or concert.
Or that I was at?
No,
or
just of all
ever?
time.
Yeah. There's a great, I'm not going to be able to produce the date for you, there's a great Rio Neato show, really small show in Northern California that I love for the history of it. It's in the book. I could probably look up the date for you. But
what year? Do you remember the year?
It's 66, I think.
Early.
It's very early, 66, 67. The cool thing about it is if you listen to, I think it's St. Stephen on the tape, you can hear them testing out Dark Star. The chords that become Dark Star, it's before they've written Dark Star. Hunter was there and listened to it and began writing Dark Star out of it. But you can hear Lesh and Garcia already playing around with it. So it's fun to listen to and to hear that. The whole show, it's also a great Pigpen performance. But I love it just because it's a little glimpse into how they worked and how they built up music.
That's a good answer. And something you learned about Garcia that surprised you in writing this book?
Two things I will say, one positive, one negative. The positive is how a hard worker he was. He was, I think some people like to think of the Grateful Dead as sort of sloppy and sort of, just sort of drifting around and noodling. He's a really exacting performer. He could be sloppy. He had bad nights, a lot of them. But he had a lot of nights too, a lot of good ones. But the intensity of his work ethic really maybe didn't, I knew he worked, but I was surprised to discover that. And I guess the other, on the other side is just the sadness of discovering how isolating and destructive his drug use was by the end. There's a little mention in the book. When I was looking through, the Grateful Dead archive has his bank statements from his later years, and you can see the bank statements in the summer of, I think it's 93 or 94, that there's like 10 or 11 trips to the ATM for $200 or $300 over and over and over again. And you can just watch him using through his bank statements. And by the end, it was so sad to me because someone who so valued this community that he really had built and created was withdrawn from it by the end. So even, in some ways to me, even sadder than his death is how much he lost in those last years.
Okay, so let's open it up for questions and answers. Vanessa has a mic. The first 5 people who ask a question will get a signed copy of this book. But we're gonna. Okay, Phil already got a copy. So.
I already got a copy.
And then after Phil, Phil, you asked the first question. But after Phil, if there are any students, I want to give students a chance. But we'll start with Phil. Okay. Phil and I are the 2 Asian American deadheads in this world. So here you got us both in one shot.
I'm glad that both are here tonight.
Well, thank you, Dr. Soni, for having this night. I was really excited to be here, and thank you, Mr. Noon, for coming down and talking about your this book. I was actually really curious to hear about your specific process in putting this book together, and I can imagine, I've been a little deadhead since '89, first show formed, right on the corner. But there are moments in time where I'm like, I'm done with this band, and I need to take a break. So I can only imagine 4 years of this and just being in deep in it, that must have been a lot. So I'd just be curious to just take us through that process of putting this book together. And did you have a breaking moment? Or you're like, okay, I need to take a step away from this, to get perspective and to kind of come back to it and kind of finish it off.
Well, I guess just briefly, in terms of process, I had worked on a proposal off and on for years, as I indicated. When Random House eventually got the book, the first thing I did was actually go see Dead & Company, who I had not seen up to that point, to just sort of get back in the flow of it. But the biggest early stop for me was the Dead Archive in Santa Cruz. So there was a lot of reading clips. The Grateful Dead had a clipping service that they employed from very early in their career, which turns out to be really valuable because so much that was written about the Dead, particularly in the early years, was underground press that's never been digitized. So it's very hard to find those clips. So for early interviews of Garcia, that was a really important resource. I tend to work kind of chronologically with a few departures. So I started at the beginning and kind of worked forward. One thing that I did discover, though, early on is that the Dead Archive doesn't have what the Eisenhower Archive has. Surprisingly, the Grateful Dead Archive and the Eisenhower Library are very different places. There's no schedule. When I was writing about Dwight Eisenhower, if you'd asked me a time of day, any time during his presidency, I could have told you exactly where he was. That is not true of Jerry Garcia. There's not really much correspondence. There's no diaries. So some of the sources that were available to other projects that I worked on just weren't there for them. So I realized fairly early that meant trying to find living people who were close to him. Many people were helpful in that. But two who were really invaluable were Mountain Girl, to whom he was, as I refer to her as his longest serving wife, and his first wife, Sarah Rupenthal. And Sarah, in some ways, even, well, there's no point in ranking them, but Sarah offered me insights into something that I was really afraid I wouldn't be able to get, which is his young adulthood. Because he wasn't famous, right? Nobody was writing about Jerry Garcia when he left the Army. I was able to get his Army records, by the way, which are sort of a travesty. So she was able to really fill in a piece of his life that I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to get my arms around. He talked a lot with her about his childhood, so some of those childhood reflections are from then. And then Mountain Girl was similarly invaluable, just in talking about him away from the stage. The interviews, he did a million interviews in his life, many of which are recorded both in audio and in print versions. But those people, generally speaking, those are music reporters who want to know about the band and its music. He's not talking in most of those interviews about his fear of drowning or his relationship with his daughters. So those other sources ended up being much more important for me. And then, all right, so just to finish, I would basically research and report a section of the book, or research, report, and write sections of the book. I then had to move some things around. The biggest structural change I had to make in the book is I initially started the book with a human being, and I couldn't, it was the wrong idea, and finally my editor pointed out to me that I just needed to move it to elsewhere in the book, so that required some reorganization. But basically the book was researched and written chronologically.
Any students here by any chance? Any students want to ask a question? Yeah. Do you have a pen? Yes, you can just sign this on.
Hi. Oh, wow, that's loud. I feel very silly. I'm like the youngest person here, but I'm going to ask anyway because my dad's a huge Deadhead.
Tell me your name. I'm going to sign your book while you're asking your question.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you so much. My dad is a huge Deadhead, and he, definitely has a lot of friends that he has gained through that community, especially growing up, in high school. So this is a very basic and sad question, but I wanted to ask, what does the Dead mean to you personally? What's the community and kind of found family that you've experienced with the community of Deadheads?
The Dead has mattered to me since I was a high school student. It was, I mentioned the US Festival. That's the show, the first show.
Wozniak, right?
It was Steve Wozniak, who was one of the founders of Apple, decided to do this giant music festival, Labor Day of 1982. I'd seen them a few times before that without really paying that much attention. But I do remember at that show, which I went to with my college roommate and one of my best friends from high school, I remember that morning, it was Breakfast with the Dead, they called it. It was the first and only time I saw them before noon. The atmosphere of the place changed. It had been sort of, kind of festival hot and uncomfortable all weekend, and people kind of jostling for position. And that morning, it was cool and calm, and Deadheads kind of took over the field and were looking out for each other and making sure people had water. And that's the first time it registered with me that this was something different, not just musical, but something spiritual and community-based. And it has been a part of my life ever since. I don't. There's no way for me to know this, but the song "He's Gone," which was on just a few minutes ago, when it reaches the line where it says "Nothing left to do but smile, smile, smile," I bet I've heard that 15,000 times, and I've smiled every single time I heard it. And so it has mattered to me. It has given me a greater appreciation for patience and for quiet and for contemplation. And it has introduced me to a community of people who care about each other. And I think that's fairly rare in modern life. It's fairly rare in my growing up. So it has definitely been a part of my life for almost as long as I can remember.
Great question, thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. I was going to.
So my name is Josephine, but I'm going to give you to my dad, and his name is Michael.
Michael, gotcha. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, and maybe when you ask your question, you can just introduce yourself to Jim as well. And he'll also personalize your book.
Hi, Jim. I'm a Mike also. Thank you, gentlemen. This is really excellent. I live here, and I live in the East Bay in Berkeley. So I've worked a lot of shows, volunteered at a lot of shows, gone to a lot of shows, met a lot of lifers. And my question is kind of for Jerry and the band in general, the original longtime members. Did they live just kind of an individual middle-class lifestyle and just proceed with the band? Did they have lives outside of that? I imagine I'm asking.
They were very poor until they suddenly became very rich. The first 20 years of the Grateful Dead, they didn't really make much money. Or rather, they made a lot of money and spent it as fast as they made it. Here's the rub in the Grateful Dead business model, which is that if you make your money touring, you have to keep touring. The nice thing about albums is they can sell while you're at home. And because they didn't make much money off the albums, they were really forced to stay on the road. They liked being on the road, but they also had to be. That was, I think, fun for them for most of that time until by the end, when Garcia started to wear out, it became, I think, a bit of a trap. They couldn't really extricate themselves from it. And the community that they were supporting got bigger and bigger too. So suddenly it wasn't just 5 band members and a couple of friends. It was hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on them continuing to keep that machine going. But Jerry was not an extravagant guy. He he didn't buy a house until the 70s. Then Mountain Girl ended up with that house, and then it was years before he bought a second house. He liked BMWs, so he had several cars. He crashed a couple of them. He played, as things got deeper and deeper in his isolation, he played a lot of video games. He watched a lot of TV and old movies. But they were not extravagant in their taste for the most part. There's a great story. I didn't actually put this in the book, which I probably should have, so oh well. There's Dennis McNally, who was the band's longtime publicist, tells a story about Jerry. This is, I think, sometime in the early 90s. And Garcia comes to him and says, "Oh my God, I just realized it's Valentine's Day and I haven't gotten anything for whoever it was he was with at the time." And McNally said, "Well, why don't you just take her out to dinner?" And he says, "Well, it's just too late to get a reservation." And he says, "I'm sorry, you're Jerry Garcia. Like, just call him and tell him anyone will let you in." And he's like, "Really? They will let me do that?" And there's something so charming about him not knowing that he could get a reservation. But he was really not a rock star. He didn't really think of himself as a rock star. He was a musician who was pleased to be paid for it. And by the end, made a lot of money doing it. But it took a long time for that real liftoff point for the Grateful Dead. Sure.
All right.
Hi, my name is Brian,
Brian.
with an I.
With an eye, got it. Appreciate that very much.
I'm going to ask 2 questions. One was about his finances. I just want to know, because I know he did file for bankruptcy, probably, no?
I don't think so. He had a lot of tax problems over the years, but I don't think it ever resulted in a bankruptcy.
Okay, then I'll ask the other question. He had a few wives, and I don't know how many children, but did everybody get along, his wives and...
No.
And, I wanted to hear you about that.
He had, 3.5 wives, I'll explain in a moment, and 4 daughters, and they don't match up wife to daughter. It's a complicated family tree. Jerry, his first wife was Sarah Rippenthal Katz. She's alive, lives in the East Bay today, and as I mentioned, was very helpful to me. They have a daughter, Heather. Then after Sarah, he then was later married to Mountain Girl. They were together for many years and had 2 daughters together before they got married, but they were married, I think, in '81. So that's his second wife. While he was married to Mountain Girl, they separated, and he cohabited with, lived with, had a daughter with Menashe, who considers herself one of his wives, but he was married to Mountain Girl during the entirety of his time with Menashe. And then at the very end of his, about 2 years before he died, he married for the last time to Deborah Coons, who was his widow, and they had no children together. So they're 4 daughters, 4 wives in a strange configuration. Most of them get along pretty well. Sarah Rupenthal and the daughters from Mountain Girl I've seen all together, and they all seem fairly compatible. The one outlier is Deborah. Deborah and Mountain Girl had a famously contentious relationship, in part because when Garcia died, he did not, unsurprisingly, have a professionally drafted will. And among other things, he'd been paying Mountain Girl $20,000 a month in kind of informal spousal support. Deborah, the moment he died, cut that off. And then Deborah didn't allow Mountain Girl to attend the funeral. And then later, when there was a scattering of ashes in San Francisco Bay, Mountain Girl tried to board the boat, and Deborah wouldn't let her on the boat. So there was a lot of bad feeling.
And the lawsuit, right? You were saying the longest
And
probate.
then, yeah, partly because those relations were so contentious, Mountain Girl sued the estate in probate. It was this very contentious probate battle, went on for years. Ultimately, there was settlement, and I think everyone is sort of at peace with it now. But it was very heated for a long time.
I think Phil Lesh got pulled into that one. He was testifying in court, and yeah, you could see how displeased he was to be in that situation.
Yeah, the fact that the probate battle went on so long meant that they were forced to testify, and there's nothing that irritated the members of the band or the community more than having to be under oath in a probate battle. So it was unpleasant for a while.
Hi, I'm Karen. I don't recall you mentioning these things. I was curious who some of his heroes were, some of his mentors in the music industry, outside the industry.
Mentors in the industry. There's a lot of musicians he admired. I wouldn't describe them as mentors. He was really quite self-taught. He got an electric guitar for I think it was his 15th birthday. Taught himself to play it, as noted, had to kind of invent a tuning for it. But he listened to a lot of music. His father ran a bar in San Francisco, Joe Garcia's it was called. And then after his father died, the family continued to have it for a time. So he listened to there was a jukebox. He would listen to the records from there. His early influences are a real mishmash of bluegrass, folk, blues, jazz. Dennis McNally, who I mentioned earlier, I was on a panel with him in San Francisco last week, and he likes to say the Grateful Dead are a jazz band that just happened to play rock and roll music. That idea, that sort of blending of sensibilities and backgrounds is very much because of Garcia. So while that doesn't really answer your mentor question, he had a lot of musical influences and that he really picked up on his own the way. Well, there's a great, in fact, Uncle John's band itself is this, let me just look it up here. There is a astonishingly, collects an astonishing array of influences. Let me see if I can find you the 239, 240. It is, the chorus is actually kind of lifted from the Bulgarian music. Here it is. It's a Bulgarian folk melody that he heard sung by the Penny Whistlers. If you listen to the original, you can hear. If you listen to Uncle John's band, next to the song, which is called Shitiu Mi Milo, by the Penny Whistlers, you can hear the little riff of Uncle John's band in it. And I mention that only because it is typical of his eclecticism, that he had a really interesting ear for things that lit with him, and so he would often bring those into the music. Again, more to influences than to mentors, but I hope that partly answers your question anyway. Sorry. Right. And it's Karen, you said? So Karyn? Yes. Gotcha.
All right, we have one more question, one more book, but we can ask questions even after that. So we'll go here. Yes,
very, very honored to have. My name is Will, and I wonder what you think of my interpretation. I'd really like to get your take on the following. The drugs brought people to places they'd never been, but they brought people together at those places. That was a community-forming drug, LSD is. And it also gives you an identity with many songs and images of songs that you are then chasing. There's always chasing of a high with respect to the dead. And also what I find so amazing with the shows that people have heard songs and so many songs and always never knowing what they're going to play. And the audience is so tuned in to being the first to begin to identify what song that is. And the band would play us for that. Iko, and Women Are Smarter. You don't know which. They're trying to tease you into guessing wrong. And so I found it was just this community, the Deadheads. It's built, I think, on the drug, on the music that tells a story about a song, and then you want to chase that high when you get that song again.
Uh-huh. No, I think that's a good frame for it, and I think I think that this may be just restating what you've just said, but one of the things that Garcia used to say about LSD is that it dampened the ego, and that it allowed other forces to flow through him because he didn't get in the way of it. And there is, I think, at its best, the Dead feels like it's channeling music almost as much as it's performing it. And that, back to the idea I suggested a little earlier of energy exchange with the audience, I think that's very much a part of that. Those of you who are not Deadheads will laugh at this, but I can remember going to shows and feeling a little bit responsible if they didn't perform well. It was like, did I fuck up? And so...
That's how I feel about my Clippers.
Yeah, there you go.
It's always my fault when they lose.
If only, if I got there a little earlier, I'd cheer a little louder. That, it's sort of ridiculous, and it's sort of a true experience, right? Well, there you go. So we know that we're speaking the same language.
And to your point, those expressions have historically happened all over the world in different places. We have many traditions that are shamanic, that are mystical, that are focused on psychotropic use or trance music that bring people together in a sort of heightened state of consciousness. This is an American version of that, but that impulse seems to be across space and time.
Yeah, no,
Will,
right? Yes.
All right. We'll go here. And we'll go.
Hi, my name is Carl Solomon. I've been to 592 shows from
We're not worthy.
Woodstock 69 to Las Vegas 94.
Wow.
And I would have been to more shows, but there were several snitches on tour. It's a long story, but anyway, when doing your research on this, on the Grateful Dead, did you try to contact people through social media? Like, I'm friends with, even today, like a few hours ago, I was communicating with Tom Constantine.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. He's doing a story. Well, he's in bad health right now, and he's doing a story he was getting to, like his time in L.A. in I think it was 72, because he had left the band. But and then I'm also like Facebook friends with Menashe, who you mentioned earlier, and. Last but not least, I'm also, like Facebook friends with Jackie LaBranche, one of the Jerryettes with the Jerry Garcia band. Do you remember them?
Sure.
Yes. So, did you try to contact any of these people?
Those people specifically, Menashe, yes. In fact, I was in touch a little bit with Menashe's lawyer. Anyway, we had some indirect
Or her
contact.
daughter?
I did not speak to her, though. I sent her the passages that mention her. So we were in communication, but I didn't speak to her directly. As to social media, yeah, I use some social media. I mean, I'm on social media, and so, a little bit. And I made no secret of the fact that I was working on the book, and so occasionally I would hear from people who had had some piece of wisdom to impart, or knew someone, or had just talked to someone. So I don't think there's any really big or important source or interview that came my way because of social media, but I've been in touch with people through social media about the book for years, yeah.
I wish you had come to me because I got some like really interesting stories.
Yeah.
Like the kleptomaniac that went on tour
yeah.
in 1980 and stole Jerry's briefcase.
Yeah.
Oh, the famous
You know that one?
Yeah, I know. I've heard of the stolen briefcase, yeah.
Yes. That was in Alaska.
I wish I had. Well, I'll do a volume 2. We'll sit down for volume 2.
Yes. There were some like really great nuggets.
I bet. Thank you.
Let's go to Jim here. Jim Burkle.
I love what you said about channeling.
I beg your pardon?
What you said about channeling.
Oh,
That's how it felt to me too, all the shows and the music. And it felt like what's being channeled is the essential energy of America. It's very American. I mean, I think Whitman, and I think Kerouac. It's like Jerry Garcia was the guitar version of Kerouac and Whitman, you know, who just sort of the condensed, refined essence of what America is. Does that? I just wonder how you relate to his
lovely.
Americanism.
I wish I'd used that in the book too. No, I think that's great. I think that's very, and you know, the connection to Whitman is a little further afield, but certainly the connection to Kerouac is almost direct. I mean,
You know, it's like guitar version of ranting.
you know, the reason that Dennis McNally became the publicist for the Dead is that McNally wrote a very interesting biography of Kerouac and sent it, or I don't know if he sent it or somehow Garcia got it, but Garcia got it and admired it and then wanted to meet him, and that started his 20-some-year career with the Grateful Dead. So, and Garcia himself would talk of On the Road as being life-changing for him. So that, in fact, McNally has a new book that's about the kind of transition from the Beats to the hippies. I've only read pieces of it so far, but it's good. And it's a lot of it delves into that period, which is a little bit before where my book starts. But yeah, I think in very much the Beats to the pranksters to the Dead, and then the Dead, of course, have to start their own history after that. But I do think there's a real line of artistic progression through there for sure.
Other questions, comments, observations, stories, vignettes? Yeah.
I was just curious.
Could you we'd appreciate the mic just because we're videotaping this. Yeah, so.
I was so. I was curious. I saw the correlation. I don't know if there's a question with this, but I saw the correlation with. I was also in San Francisco in August over those anniversary shows, and I in speaking to some lifer Deadhead family people, traveling all over, like you said, I see the correlation between what you were saying with Jerry having absolutely no political affiliation, in fact, kind of being against it, quote unquote, maybe living off the grid, and the people, the hardcore people who are following these days. Would you say that there's a similarity rather with that?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite following the similarity between what and what?
You were explaining earlier that Jerry's life was like he made it known that there's no political affiliation. I don't align with, you know, that he was very independent of all those things. And I kind of see that similarity in the kind of hardcore, long-time lifer situation who are, you know, living off the grid.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, that's not the core community that I have most connected with through this project anyway. And I'm thinking about people like McNally and David Gans and David Lemieux, a few others who are sort of still within that, the Grateful Dead orbit. Well, I'll use Gans as an example. Gans was the founder of Deadheads for Kamala, right? He's not off the grid or out of politics. If only there were a few more Deadheads. But so I actually think the Grateful Dead community that I intersect with these days is, I think, much more political than the one that I would have found in the 70s or 80s. I think it's always been there, and as I said earlier, not to repeat myself, but I think that there's a way to think of the Dead as more political even than they did. And it's also true that the Dead by the end were much more engaged in causes than they were at the beginning. Not just community causes, but things like rainforest protection and AIDS. And never candidates, but they were more cause friendly. That's why they created the Rex Foundation, was to fund causes. I don't think of most Deadheads today as being sort of off the grid or out of they may be out of the mainstream culture, but they're not out of the counterculture. They're on sort of there, doing what many of them have been doing for decades now, which is kind of nibbling at the edges of things they think are wrong.
Phil.
Just one more. So a lot of talk about Dead 60, and I just wanted to kind of riff on that for a second. I was at Dead 50 at Fare Thee Well, and I remember thinking, yeah, maybe this is it, because it was sort of winding down. The shows weren't that good, but there was a nice swan song of an event. But then I was at Dead 60, and then of course we all know that wasn't it, and there was a whole big run that happened, and Dead & Company brought a lot of life to it. Dead 60, on the other hand, at the end of it, I felt like, wow, this thing is bigger than it's ever been. That it's a multi-generational thing, there's a lot of talent, and there's a lot of the spirit of the energy was really alive and well, it seemed, to me at least. Yeah. So I was just curious from your perspective, one, do you feel the same way? Mm-hmm. And then two, what do you think are the essential ingredients that are keeping this going? And how long do we think we have? Do you think, is this going to go on forever and ever, and whatever? So there you go.
I mean, I think it depends on what you mean by the it. First of all, yes, I agree. I thought the shows in San Francisco, something about those shows in San Francisco was poignant, right? It's really going right back to the beginning. It's literally the same turf as the Human Bee, only now it's 60,000 people paying $200 a night instead of wandering onto the grass. But it's a big, successful commercial and also culturally significant enterprise. So there's no reason for that to stop anytime soon. I heard, maybe I shouldn't say this on the camera, but I've heard it said that the band makes $1 million a night at the Sphere. Whatever, I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but it's a lot of money. So it's a big enterprise. I guess if by the it you mean people gathering, enjoying one another, experiencing this kind of communal euphoria around the music of the Grateful Dead, then I can imagine that going on for a very long time. If we mean the particulars of Dead & Company with Bob Weir and Bob's, the shows in San Francisco, it seemed like he was getting kind of old, and he is kind of old. And so I don't think that goes on forever. But it's sort of like the bionic man. If you replace him one limb at a time, at what point does he stop being the original person, right? I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that just Mickey Hart is left. But maybe they play a little while longer with Bobby. People love him. I mean, it's fun for me to see Weir after all, because I spent all those years focusing on Garcia, and Weir seemed like kind of his sort of a little brother off to the side. And now Weir is really at the center of this whole undertaking. I feel good for him. Like it feels like he's really in his moment. So I hope they have a little left in them, and I hope that something goes on after that. I think something does.
The it that I was thinking about was the songbook.
Yeah.
And how everlasting this thing is going to be, and I imagine it will be lifetime.
It could be like Beethoven. You could go to any American city and hear Beethoven, and in 50 years, maybe you go to any American city and hear the Grateful Dead. And maybe, and Bobby's vision for a Dead & Company, as you know, is that like when he and Mickey are gone, then they'll bring in other people, and it'll be John's band. Exactly. Yeah. My 3-year-old can be touring with the John Mayer Grateful Dead experience in 20 years. Yeah. And that way, it's kind of like Menudo. You can just plug and play the members, and they keep going on and on.
Yeah, I think that's possible. Listen, I don't think the music of there's no reason to think that the music of the Grateful Dead goes away.
I mean, it is the great American songbook, isn't it?
It is. There is no more there's no body of music that coalesces more strains of American music than the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
And so that's, why not keep playing it? You know? I mean, and get away from just Dead and Company. There are thousands of musicians, tens of thousands probably, who are playing the music of the Grateful Dead. There's probably someone playing a Grateful Dead song every moment of every day somewhere.
Dark Star never ended.
Yeah, right. It just keeps going. So that, I don't see any reason why that would stop.
That's great. Other questions, comments? I think Will has one. Yeah. Can we just, let's just do it on the mic for the video.
So, to your thoughts about the guitar playing in rank 34, which isn't bad, of course. A lot of those before him are guitarists that you always recognize, you know, as soon as you hear that. There's no question that when you hear Jerry, you know it's Jerry. The guitar has got a voice that is absolutely, as is his voice. So there's these two voices with this band. But I think what I wonder what you think of the following, that the guitar playing of Jerry, emotional, as all great guitarists are emotional in their playing, but Jerry would go, wow, he could take you so high, and he could take you so freaking low, making you feel like it was so much your fault of whatever was bad about the show. The range of emotion in his guitar playing, I think, if that's a ranking, he's going to be number one.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So I think that's, any last questions, anyone? So, please join me in thanking our very special guest. Thank you.